Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to see you. My name is Mark Massa. I'm the director of the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life. I was told by tonight's convener to make this short and sweet, so this is my elevator speech. You might want to go to the Boise website. It's bc.edu/Boise, B-O-I-S-I. I know we're all tempted to say Boise, but it's actually Boise. We have a lot of stuff going on. I just want to highlight a couple things. Well, before that, next Tuesday, September 28th, Bosie's hosting a graduate students only event with two of our biggest public intellectuals at BC, Professor Heather Cox Richardson of the History Department and Professor Kathleen Caveney of the Theology Department and the Law School. So if you're a graduate student and want to be there, let us know. It's called So You Want to Be a Public Intellectual. I actually wanted to call it So You Want to Be an Academic and Make a Lot of Money, but they wouldn't let me say that. So, but if you're interested and a graduate student, please come to see us. On Wednesday, October 6th, we're finally, at long last, doing our much delayed annual Prophetic Voices lecture. It's our 19th annual Prophetic Voices lecture. Featuring Jonathan Lee Walton. Jonathan was preacher to Harvard University and is now dean of the Wake Forest Divinity School, and he's giving a lecture entitled Blessed Are the Rich, the American Gospel of Success. On Thursday, November the 4th, we're hosting both a screening and a discussion of an award-winning documentary on the Catholic author Flannery O'Connor. So we're going to we'll screen the film, and then there'll be a panel discussion with Mark Bosco, who is the person who made the film, and also with Angela O'Donnell, who teaches at Fordham University. Right through the middle of Father Bretzke's head here, we have a lunch colloquium called Race Theology. Thank you, Jim. Race Theology and Pedagogy. We regularly have lunch colloquia. There is such a thing as a free lunch, and it takes place at the Boise Center. So just let us know you want to come. We have lots of faculty seminars and other things going on. So look us up, and please let us know if you're interested in any of these things. And also, we're always interested in your feedback. So welcome, and let the games begin. Okay. You want to hold that?
Yeah, that's fine. Good evening, everyone. It's my absolute privilege to be moderating this discussion, conversation that I am sure will be interesting and challenging. But before I do, I want to bring your attention to one particular item. So usually we open the floor to questions at the conclusion of our conversation between the panelists. We have intended in past events to try to increase the number of questions that we can take by having you write them on index cards, and we bring them and pull them together, and I ask them as rapid fire as possible. Well, changing hands and all of that stuff is a little bit more precarious in COVID, and so every few chairs in your rows is a QR code that will take you to a Google form. So you can access the form by scanning the QR code either with a reader or on your camera, on your phone, and that'll take you to a form where you can fill it out, indicate which panelists you wish to ask questions to, and fill out your question itself. It will come to my cell phone, so no, I am not texting my spouse. While I'm scrolling through that, I'm just getting your questions ready for our wonderful panelists. So if for whatever reason that is not possible and you still have a question, just note that you have a question, catch my eye, I'll be scanning the audience, and we have microphones that we can accommodate as well, so if you prefer not to use the QR code. I'm really privileged, overwhelmingly privileged, to be joined by four really remarkable thinkers, really remarkable writers that I'd like to introduce you all to, some of whom you may already know. And I'll begin right here to my left. Jeannine Hill Fletcher is a constructive theologian whose research is at the intersection of Christian systematic theology and issues of diversity, including gender, race, and religious diversity. She's the author of 3 books that examine the intersectional realities of religious diversity, including her most recent, The Sin of White Supremacy, Christianity, Racism, and Religious Diversity in America, from Orbis in 2017. Other titles include Monopoly on Salvation, a feminist approach to religious pluralism, and Motherhood as Metaphor, Engendering Interreligious Dialogue. She's a professor of theology at Fordham University in the Bronx, and board member of the grassroots social justice organization, the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition. an intergenerational, multiracial, multi-religious group organizing to address social justice issues in New York City and beyond. To her left is James Bretzke of the Society of Jesus. He is a professor of theology at the Jesuit John Carroll University in suburban Cleveland, Ohio. Prior to coming to John Carroll in 2019, he taught for a decade each in the 2 graduate theology centers run by the Society of Jesus in the United States, the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley and the School of Theology and Ministry at Boston College. He also has served as Theology and Religious Studies Chair at the University of San Francisco and has taught at several other Jesuit schools around the world, including the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, where he did his doctorate under Jacques Dupuy. He is also a frequent go-to person for the media on a range of topics related to the Church in the United States and the world. He is the author of over 90 scholarly articles and reviews and 9 books, including A Morally Complex World, Engaging Contemporary Moral Theology, Consecrated Phrases, a Latin theological dictionary, and a Handbook of Moral Terms. He is currently working on a book dealing with a new moral methodology called the Moral Triangle to analyze contested contemporary ethical issues. First in the grouping at the far end of the stage is Laurel Marshall Potter. She is a PhD candidate in systematic and comparative theology at Boston College, with interests including decolonial thought and praxis, Latin American liberation theologies, and digital scholarship. Her most recent work can be found in the NACLA report and in the collection Valuing Lives, Healing Earth from the European Society for Women in Theological Research. Laurel's dissertation will explore the Mesoamerican reception of Sacrosanctum Concilium and the Eucharistic celebrations of ecclesial-based communities in that region today. And to her left, and finally, is James Carroll. James is the author of 12 novels and 8 works of nonfiction, including most recently, The Truth at the Heart of the Lie, How the Catholic Church Lost Its Soul. For 23 years, he wrote an op-ed column for the Boston Globe, and his work has appeared in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and other publications. A fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, he has received the National Book Award, the Penn Galbraith Award, and the Scripps Howard Award. He lives in Boston with his wife, the writer Alexandra Marshall. So welcome each and every one of you to this conversation. I'd like to begin by sort of asking a very broad question based on the title of our panel tonight. As we were planning this discussion, we were thinking about the ramifications of the sex abuse scandal, the forgiveness of offending priests and the institution that covered it up, and whether or if at all the Catholic Church as an institution can be forgiven, especially given Jesus' ongoing calls to forgiveness. How are we to deal with the Church as an institution, and what does or might institutional forgiveness look like, if it's possible at all?
So Zach has indicated that we'll just start our conversation heading this way, and I wanted to begin both by thanking the folks at the Blasey Center and also for all of us entering back into our time together in conversation, actually in person. So it's just delightful to be here. I am also appreciative of going first in order to set up some of the ways that I'm still thinking through the question of forgiveness. And as I began to think through that question of forgiveness, it is thinking about forgiveness in response to egregious failures of institutions, we might even say a Catholic society point of view, right, that this is egregious. And so I began to think about who we might consult around the globe, right, responding to egregious events like this. And so folks like theologians who are responding from out of the South African context and their Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and the practical theologian Dion Foster really kind of caught my attention by simply stating that forgiveness would need to be a process of social transformation. Right? And he insists that, and these are his words, we can only truly speak of forgiveness and transformation in relational terms. So we're thinking about forgiveness not just kind of on an individual, we're gonna grant this forgiveness, but we're thinking about this, or at least I am thinking about this, as a process that requires institutional and social transformation. Again, I'm sorry that Father Jim is stuck in the limelight here, but I also found it very helpful thinking with Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who is responding to the trauma, the historical trauma on the part of Indigenous people, and asking the question, can we transcend this trauma? And I found that very helpful as a framework, right? That forgiveness isn't just kind of a one-off, it's really needs to be a process. And so what I have here is her format, and I've also included in the blue on the outside the Jesuit Reconciliation Project that's going on at Redbud Indian School, right? Where they are also thinking about this experience of the possibility of moving beyond or addressing or responding to egregious social historical traumas, and how might that happen? And so what you see in the middle is her 4 steps. And when I was thinking with her 4 steps, I said, well, if forgiveness goes anywhere, it's this 3rd step in her description here. And I'm not even sure that she's thinking about forgiveness, right? Her first step is confronting the historical trauma or truth-telling, right? And how much truth-telling still needs to happen. The second is understanding the trauma, engaging in an analysis of why did this, what were the conditions that made this possible? And it's only in the 3rd section here that she describes releasing the pain, right? But I don't know whether releasing the pain is forgiveness, right? Is forgiveness necessary there, right? But that's where, when the Jesuits at Red Cloud began their process, they're placing healing in that 3rd position, right? Is forgiveness a step of healing, or does forgiveness place too much responsibility on the victims, too much onus on those who have experienced the egregious harm? And then finally, it's only in this last segment here, transcending the trauma, but that's the transformation. Right? And it seemed to me that the committee out at Gonzaga, who just released their report, the committee out at Gonzaga is saying a similar thing, right? And so I've included 2 quotes from their report. One that you can read probably better than I can here. A danger of longing for reconciliation, healing, and forgiveness that moves too quickly past anger and lament. Right? Moves too quickly past anger and lament against the injustice and the clear recognitions of the wrongs of sexual abuse. In such cases, reconciliation may remain shallow and leave injustice in place. Again, this idea that forgiveness, if it were to happen, would be a part of a process and would require some sort of transformation. And what in this section of the report, the committee, they didn't quite conclude, and now I have to look and see what they said, because I've got you in the, I'm not sure I have them here, Father Jim. So, okay, so the bottom line, as you might imagine, and you can see the report that they've presented, is that reconciliation is only made possible with the establishment of justice and transformation. New systems in place, right, that seek to dismantle the systems of domination, abuse, and harm. Right? And so my own thinking, and I'll have to end here, I'll come back to this, my own thinking is that we are in a process. And so forgiveness, if it's to take place, needs to be part of this longer process. My own interest is in thinking about the root causes, right? So I'm kind of in that analysis quadrant, and I'll come back to that, right? We need to think about and do the truth-telling of the impact of the sexual abuse crisis, but we also need to be doing the analysis of the root causes. As a theologian, I'm interested in exploring what ideologies, what practices, and what forms of biblical interpretation might still be part of the structure of the community that still need to be addressed if we're thinking about transformation. Sorry.
So that was wonderful. I think, I mean, I couldn't see it, but if you saw through me. For 25 years or so, when I was teaching in our seminary programs, I taught a course that was called Confessional Ministry. And it was the course that would help seminarians grow into celebrating the sacrament of reconciliation. It used to be for people, presbyteral candidates only, but both in Berkeley and here at Boston College, I also opened it up if space was available to people who weren't going to be ordained. So I had men and women who were not seeking ordination, and that was a very interesting course. We did a lot of role playing in it because, that's how you grow into it. And the experience I had over the 20 plus years of teaching the course is that when we would do the original role playing of a confession, the person who was playing the priest would tend to go into a therapeutic mode and absolve the penitent from guilt. And I used to say, don't absolve people from guilt, absolve them from sin. And I think that that's more than just a word play, because I think that really is the heart of the mystery of sin. Whereas St. Paul says, where sin abounds, there the grace the more abounds. And so I believe that is how sacramental theology is meant to work, because the sacrament is, to quote my formational text, the Baltimore Catechism, an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace. So it really does invite us into some sort of an encounter which hopefully is grace-filled. But I think in American culture for the last several decades, we have been pretty much governed by the paradigm of the therapeutic. And I'm not against the therapeutic, but a therapeutic mode I brought, if I had been better, I would have gotten a I would have gotten slides up too. So you just have to trust that this is true. So what I'm looking at is something that I found, on the internet. And it says, forgiveness is not something we do for other people. We do it for ourselves to get well and move on. Now, I believe that to be true, but I don't believe it to be the whole truth, because there is something about forgiveness that I think can be a graced response to sin. Now, for a good deal of the church's history, we've been working in the paradigm of individual sins confessed by an individual, to which a penance is given individually, and then the penitent is absolved individually from his or her sins. At Vatican II, that paradigm began to shift a little bit when after the council, they developed two other rituals, two other rites for the sacrament. One was individual absolution, but in the kind of a common form, like a penance service in a church. And many of you, I suspect, have seen that, or given to a larger number of people with no individual confession. So when Pope John Paul II became Pope in 1978, which was the year I started my theology studies, he was clearly uncomfortable with that paradigm shift, and he put, as far as he could, brakes on the third rite of forgiveness being given with no individual confession of sin, and he was clearly not overly happy either with the second rite. Early on in his pontificate, they had the triennial synod of bishops that was meeting on the theme of forgiveness, and in his post-synodal exhortation, which is titled Reconciliation and Penance, he dealt with this notion of social sin, and he frankly discounted it. He said, well, we can talk about social sin to the extent that individuals are social beings and there is some sort of collective, I suppose, amplification of sins, but ultimately sin is personal, sin is individual, and that's how it has to be addressed. So that was his 1982 Apostolic Synod. I think by the end of his pontificate, the paradigm had begun to shift a little bit for him as well, and I think towards the end of his pontificate, I think he did realize that there was such a thing as social sin, mostly through the lens of liberation theology. And he was able to say then that there is serious sin that can be structural. But he frankly, at least in my view, did not, run with that very much. I started my postdoctoral teaching at the Pontifical Gregorian University, which was founded in 1551 by Ignatius of Loyola, and that's where I had done my own dissertation. And that was, while I was teaching there at the Gregorian, that was when Pope John Paul II rehabilitated Galileo, saying what they had in the meantime discovered that not everything revolved around the sun, around the earth. And when I was, living there and teaching there, there were some of my fellow professors that thought that it was very wrong, that the Pope should never have publicly apologized. Not that they believed that everything was revolving around the earth, but they believed that if the Pope were to apologize and admit error as the head of the Catholic Church, this would limit or reduce the faith that individuals would have in the church. And I think there is the nub with this sex abuse crisis and everything else, and this reluctance of the church to confess, to admit that yes, we have sinned not just individually, but we have sinned corporately, and that our structures are sinful as well. And I believe all of those things to be true, but Father Massa has a wonderful book where he uses this notion of paradigm shifts. Paradigms don't shift easily or quickly. And so I would say, where are we right now? Well, we're in the middle of a very long and difficult paradigm shift. Let me end with, when I do teach this material in my courses, when I move into social sin and structural evil, I'm a frustrated art historian, and I put up on the screen Marc Chagall's White Crucifixion. Now, you can Google that if you want, or hopefully you will have seen it at one point in your time. It's a magnificent painting. It shows Jesus Christ clad in the Jewish prayer shawl on the cross, and he is clearly the center, but all around him is all of this terrible sin and sinfulness that has been visited on the Jewish people in the name of Christianity. And that, I think, is part of the reality of our faith as well. What do we do with this deeper sin? Great theologian in the World War II era, German Lutheran Protestant Dietrich Bonhoeffer, had this notion of what he called cheap grace and costly grace, really dealing with sin and forgiveness. I think involves what Bonhoeffer would call costly grace, because it costs God God's own Son. Cheap grace is our default kind of human tendency to find an easier way out. And certainly the sacrament of confession has been often used as a form of cheap grace. What I used to call my students the car wash model. You drive it up to the confessional and you point out, I got a clump of mud here and I got this there, and drive it through, and then I'm all clean, but I haven't really had to do too much inside. And so these are all paradigms that I think have to change. Where sin abounds, grace the more abounds. If that's true for individual sin, then I would posit it has to also be true for social sin. So if we're talking about social sin, we have to talk about, in some way or another, social grace, and I can come back to that in the next go-round.
Thanks, Jim. Laurel.
Hi, everybody. This has been a great, I'm already writing and taking notes here on my paper. I'm excited for this conversation. I do want to start by coming to the gospel passage that the title of this talk is based on. 70 times 7, my translation's a little bit different, but it's the right idea. Matthew 18, 21 to 22. Then Peter came to him and said, "Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times?" And Jesus said to him, "Not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times." So as central as this passage is today for our reflection, I want to begin by reminding myself and us all that this is not the entirety of Jesus' message. These are 2 verses from one of 4 gospels in a whole volume of collected works over millennia. And there's something missing from this passage, which is an essential movement of the forgiveness, pardon, sin dynamic. And that's the role that repentance and accountability play in prompting forgiveness, as we've already alluded to. In the gospel, forgiveness seems to come immediately after the sin. An immediate wiping of the slate, a new beginning, required endlessly, it seems, in a context of social or structural sin. And so taking this excerpt from the Gospels in the total context of Jesus' ministry among the poor and marginalized, victims of abuse and exclusion, I don't believe that Jesus intended to omit repentance and justice, which are conditions for the possibility of true forgiveness. So I'd like to offer another account of forgiveness, this one from Pope Francis's most recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. I'm going to read most of a paragraph. He writes, "Loving an oppressor does not mean allowing him or her to keep oppressing us or letting them think that what they do is acceptable. On the contrary, true love for an oppressor means seeking ways to make them cease their oppression. It means stripping them of a power that they do not know how to use, and that diminishes their own humanity and that of others. Forgiveness does not entail allowing oppressors to keep trampling on their own dignity and that of others, or letting criminals continue their wrongdoing. Those who suffer injustice have to defend strenuously their own rights and those of their family, precisely because they must preserve the dignity they have received as a loving gift from God. If a criminal has harmed me or a loved one, no one can forbid me from demanding justice and ensuring that this person or anyone else will not harm me or others again. This is entirely just. Forgiveness does not forbid it, but actually demands it." So there's a lot to unpack in there, I think. But the Pope is clear that forgiveness depends on justice. It's not the first step, but the end of a long process. Without sincere repentance and practical steps towards repairing the harm done and preventing it from happening again, forgiveness is not possible. And this is what I think Jesus means when he says we must forgive 77 or 7 times 7 times. This repentance and justice is part of that. So what's challenging about this gospel passage is not an appeal to forgive and forget harm that is done, or an attempt to create some sort of false unity or cheap peace, cheap grace. The task is rather different. It is to continue to call sinners to repentance, to have ears to hear true repentance and contrition, and to hold out hope for the possibility of conversion of the oppressors. So on a slightly different note, I also want to address something that Jeannine brought up, distinguishing forgiveness from closure or healing. I would tend to distinguish them as opposed to uniting them in one step. The kind of forgiveness that's dependent on justice and repentance might take away the agency then of victims to move on if forgiveness is tied to those things. So I've been thinking about how to keep the victim's agency to heal and have closure and move on, to disallow this harm and this affront to their dignity to continue to affect their lives and their faith. How victims can exercise our own agency, to heal from harm, and disallow these experiences to hold sway over us. A final category of people that I think play in this dynamic, besides the person directly affected or the community directly affected or the person or the community affecting the harm, are people who are not necessarily victims but nevertheless form part of the community. For those of us who are not victims of clerical sexual abuse or who are not victims of other kinds of ecclesial abuse and exclusion, the question of forgiveness is often a question about staying in the church. I think that's an element of our discussion today. If we are to stand in solidarity with our siblings who are victims, how can I continue to lend my belonging and my life and my faith and my profession of faith to an institution that so often blasphemes the image of the divine and my siblings and so in the Son of God to whom we belong? So there's a question about ecclesial unity here. And I would like to tease for now that my response to that question has to do with where we locate the center of ecclesial belonging. If ecclesial unity is always a reconciliation of the margins to the center, of the emergent to the normative, of the laity to the magisterium, of the contextual to the standard, then the question of the gravity of inertia will always pull us heavily towards the status quo, towards what already is. So if we work, though, to reorient our understanding of ecclesial unity and reconciliation as at least sometimes a movement from the center of an unhealthily held power towards the margins, from inside the city out to the wilderness, then I think our discourse about unity and reconciliation can be helpful.
Thank you, Laurel. Jim.
Good evening, my friends. Can you hear me okay? I have obvious reasons for being moved and honored to be part of this discussion, having heard these powerful statements. And I would like to respond to them, but also to add one particular example, aside from the tragedy and crime of clerical abuse, that might give us a way to think about this question. But first, I should acknowledge, in a way, I have a kind of confession to make. Forgive me, Father. Which is that when Mark invited me to be part of this conversation, and then when Zach and I picked up the conversation, the first thing I said was forgiveness as the subject of a convening at Boston College. I'm the wrong person to ask, because I think forgiveness being raised as an issue by an institution essentially and wonderfully identified with the Catholic Church, it's premature. That before we take on the question of forgiveness, we have to take on the prior question of change. I'm a Catholic of the generation that was taught about the prerequisites for my being forgiven in confession, and one of them was what I was trained to call, and I know Jim will remember this, if not everyone does, a firm purpose of amendment, which is another fancy way, almost Latin way of saying change. And the Catholic Church has not shown any serious readiness to change what Jeannine lifted up as the deep roots of this crime. And in Jim's powerful invitation, this sin. And we are part of a tradition in which this discussion of forgiveness has come from on high, from a tradition and an institution, a church, that assumes that individuals need to be forgiven, but the church doesn't. Wonderful analogy to Marc Chagall's crucified Jesus as a Jew, because the analogy I want to lift up is the Holocaust. It was not remotely possible to imagine that the Christian tradition or the Catholic Church could ask to be forgiven for its failure during the genocide against the Jewish people, even though that failure was quite clear and blatant. What happened before any question of forgiveness? Obviously, there was a powerful apology issued by John Paul II at the millennium, paired with a powerful, profound statement we remember issued by the Vatican itself, an effective examination of conscience on the sin of anti-Semitism. And I want to return to we remember in a minute as an example of the problem. But I'm of the generation of Catholics whose faith was shaped by the way in which the church did find it possible, before discussing forgiveness for the Holocaust, for its complicity with the Holocaust, to change. And I'm talking, of course, about the Second Vatican Council. Its essential taking on of the question of the church's relationship with the Jewish people, which Pope John the 23rd insisted had to be on the agenda. You could imagine the Monsignor saying, "What's to discuss?" But John the 23rd had been a witness to the church's failure, as you know, one of the few prelates to actively resist the genocide. The church's relationship to the Jewish people was to be centrally considered by the fathers of the Second Vatican Council, and they did. A very struggling, uneven, reluctant reckoning that led to Nostra Aetate, about which you know, the declaration in our time of the church's relationship to the Jewish people. And what did it do? It went to the root cause, what Jeannine pointed to, the root cause of the church's failure during the Holocaust. In fact, not just the church's failure, but the ground that had prepared the way for the Nazi lethal anti-Semitism, which was the 2,000-year-long history, almost, of Christian, of holy, of sacred Christian anti-Judaism. And the Council Fathers took that on directly and addressed the engine of anti-Judaism, which was the Christ killer charge lodged against the Jewish people, and Nostra Aetate renounced it. No more saying the Jews murdered Jesus. That set in motion the process that both Jeannine and Laurel are looking for, the process toward reconciliation, toward the point where forgiveness is an appropriate issue. The process begun with Nostra Aetate, that profound change addressing the Christ killer charge, look what it led to. It led to a further affirmation, well, not further, but a first affirmation of the permanence of the covenant God made with the people Israel. It led beyond that to adjustments in the way in which the church taught about its relationship to the Jewish people. And it affirmed that the Jewish people, through that covenant, have direct access to God. Therefore, as Pope Francis himself made official only a couple of years ago, the church renounces its mission to convert the Jews. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most important, the most transforming, largest change in Catholic theology, ideology, in history. That was a response to the Holocaust. I'd say, by the way, despite the power of that response, which included, of course, a requirement that we change the way we read our scriptures, since the Christ killer charge is lodged in the Gospels themselves. But that response goes so much more deeply into the structure of Catholic imagination than anything having to do with the root causes of the sex abuse crisis. So before we talk about forgiving the church for the failures related to clerical sexual abuse, which are, of course, a minority of predator priests, but an absolute majority, almost universal behavior of Catholic bishops who protected the predators instead of the victims, what that laid bare, the same way the Holocaust laid bare deep ideology, practice, theology, ways of reading scripture, laid bare, the predator priests and the complicit bishops lay bare basic structures, obviously clericalism, rooted in male supremacy, rooted in a neurotic, anti-human rejection of authentic sexuality, rooted in a caste system of power, a pyramid of structural power, an authority structure of the Catholic Church rooted not in the gospel, but in the Roman Empire and in medieval forms of monarchy, which pervert how we remember Jesus, and they poison how we believe in God. Because the God who presides over this pyramid is a God of doom. And if you are not properly blessed by that pyramid, you are condemned to an eternal lake of hellfire. which is a polluting of Catholic belief and practice, most obviously in relationship to the sacrament of penance, which becomes perverted. And Jim has spent his career fighting against this perversion quite clearly, perverted into a kind of pass so that you can go to heaven and not go to hell through the ministrations of a priest, a power given to the forgiving priest that was part of what was corrupting the clerical culture, alas. So before forgiveness is our major purpose, change at these deep levels must be authentically begun. And the revelation we have is that even the good Pope Francis, as good a Pope as we could ever have hoped for, has not begun change at this level.
Thank you, Jim. Let me pick up on a few of the words and phrases that I'm hearing to ask a particular question about the role of Catholicism and the Catholic Church itself as being a particular ecclesial body that has certain forms and certain systems in place that make the relationship between the layperson or the faithful in general and the institution much more significant than some with their own institutional churches. You know, we're talking a lot about the role of clericalism. We're talking a lot about the Catholic imagination. We've discussed the notion of structures and structures that act on us. In the School of Theology and Ministry, Daniel Daly talks about structures of virtue and vice as ways of breaking free from structure of sin as a sort of a structure as an agent, but instead saying this structure facilitates someone to a virtuous life or facilitates a vicious life. So does the ecclesiology of the Roman Church make this problem more complex? Does its history, does the way that it mediates grace in our relationship with God and the sacraments, does that make this much more complex than it could otherwise be? And while I know, Jim, you mentioned Pope Francis and some of the changes that are or aren't being made with Francis, I'm wondering if Francis is beginning to sort of harp on clericalism as he has in the last few years. Are those just hollow words? What does that signify? So we'll go through the rounds again. So we'll start with Jeannine if she's ready.
The way that you brought us to this out of this conversation that has developed, I am honing in on this question of whether the church, the Catholic Church as it is structured, is a structure that I would want to say is a structure of vice. Jim, you did just a beautiful job of saying, look, the structure itself, a structure of male supremacy. How could that ever bring forth virtue? A structure of a caste system of power. And Jim, as you were describing that, I was thinking with this idea of transformation and this possibility that the church could change and could adopt other structures and other forms. But I'm as a theologian, I'm kind of stuck with the sense that the very structure itself would lean me towards seeing it as a structure of vice or a structure of evil, right? And that we just don't even see it anymore. And the place that I went to, sorry that I keep coming back to my slides, the place that I went to on this, and we just kind of overlook it. We say, oh, it's a hierarchical church. It's like, well, the way that so this is from Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the church from Vatican II. And the idea that human beings, right, come in various ranks, that the church is composed of people of various ranks. We just take it, Catholic theology, Catholic doctrine just takes it as a given that human beings come in different ranks. Well, that's terribly problematic. And I would have to say that's a structure of vice. Right? That's a structure of evil to think that human beings, some are better than others, right? Is it a structure of vice right? That the bishops preside in the place of God? Like, is that how we think God works? That human beings can just step into the place of the infinite source of the universe and preside in God's place? And yet, right, we kind of just say, well, but that's just the way the Catholic Church is structured, right? And so I'm really kind of right in that place of saying, yes, transformation, and yes, the possibility that the church could change. But between if we have a church that is reluctant to admit its own failure, right? Are we as panelists, are we hopeful for that change? Do we think that change could really happen, that we would no longer have a caste system of power and a system of male supremacy? So I've just reshaped I've kind of said,
fine,
okay,
yeah.
I want to know, do we really think this transformation is possible? Is there a way that I can turn this on?
I don't.
Not really. It doesn't need to be this one up here. You want to go down? Oh, yeah, perfect.
One of the early best theology books that I read that still stays with me today came out when I was not too long. I entered the Jesuits a mere 52 years ago. So this came out in the early 70s, and it was by a Jesuit theologian, Avery Dulles, who ended up teaching at Fordham and also taught at the Greg. We taught at the same time. And his monumental work, I think, is his models of the church. And I'm sure that many people here are familiar with the book, have read it, and hopefully know at least the basic thesis of it. And the basic thesis, as I recall, is that there is not just one way to look at the church or just one model, but there are, depending on where you are and when you are, there are different models. I think what we're talking about here a lot point out the difficulties with the prevailing Roman Catholic model of the church, which is the institutional. And that was, Dulles said, no model really can stand by itself, but he said the one that he considered to be theologically non-viable for the long term for the church was the institutional model. He looked at the church as servant. He looked at the church as herald. He looked at the church as sacrament. And the last model that he developed, which I think is a very American model, is the church as a community of disciples, because of all of them, it's the most democratic. It's the one where we can all come together. And I think, to go back to an earlier thing that I said about paradigm shift, we're in the middle or the beginning or a third of the way through a paradigm shift. Or we could say we're in the death throes of the institutional model, and I believe that may well be true. I think what Pope Francis is trying to do is provide another model, another path ahead, and he is getting a good deal of resistance from around the world, but certainly no country that produces greater resistance than the United States. We have seminaries here where the seminarians will proclaim, this is a Francis-free zone. These are men in diocesan seminaries training for the priesthood who are saying, we don't follow the Pope. This is a Francis-free zone, and we want to get back to John Paul III or Pius XIII or something like that. What Pope Francis, I think, is calling us to is this notion of synodality. And synod is the Greek word for syn, S-Y-N, not S-I-N, together, and then the Greek word for a path. It is walking together. Well, if we're going to be walking together, then that is a different model. And I hope that we can move into it. The last thing that I would say that maybe will negate just what I just was getting at, I lived for some time of my life in Asia. in Korea in a Confucian culture. And it's a very different way of looking at the world and institutions in the world. So we like the community disciples, and we like synodality because it's democratic and equal. That is not the default setting if you are in a Confucian culture. The default setting is hierarchical. And so that's going to be a tension in a world church.
Sure. I think Jeannine's question is exactly the point of today. Do we have hope? How could we possibly? I think, Jim, your explanation of the church's conversion away from anti-Semitism is a reason for hope. It's a past example of attempts that the church has made to convert. We're about at that historical time, after the Holocaust to the end of Vatican II, from the Globe report to now, as far as where we're at in terms of time, when certainly clerical sexual abuse was happening before the Globe reported on it, but the watershed moment for us in Boston was about 20 some years ago. Do we have hope that the church can change? I don't know that I have hope if it's dependent on our human ability to create and enact the new models. I don't know that we're very good at coming up with models that are less sinful. If we look at the state of the world today, if we look at our inability to confront climate devastation, if we look at our inability to reconcile with the racist history of the United States, if we look at our inability to control human organ trafficking in the world, I don't really know that human beings are great at coming up with the answers. I think that if we have hope, it's got to be a hope in God's continued action in the world. When we say in the Creed on Sunday, we hope for the resurrection of the dead, that's kind of a nonsensical phrase or clause sometimes, but I think what that means is we hope for impossible things to happen. We hope for the people who have been plowed under by our human structural, social, personal sins of history to come back and look at us in the face and to reconcile with them. And that's what we need to have happen for the church to be converted, to allow God's action to restructure our church. I think that the synodal way that Francis is articulating and is living and practicing is excellent. I think that allowing more members of the church and different kinds of people to form part of the official authoritative teaching office of the church is necessary. And I think that our fellow Christian denominations have experiences also with other models of church and the pros and cons that they bring. So this has to be an ecumenical conversation. Clerical sex abuse, clericalism, abuse and exclusion on a church level is not a uniquely Catholic problem. And so I think we have to speak and dialogue with our Christian sisters, brothers, siblings in other denominations too, to hear about their experiences with the pros and cons of their ecclesiological models also. So dialogue, synod, conversation, and an awareness that power and pushing change through historically has not been our best bet.
Wow, so much to keep up with, the brilliant ideas and thoughts flashing around this conversation. Let me just pick up a couple. Zach began by asking us if ecclesiology is an issue, a problem for us. Of course it is. When I was initiated into the church as a young person, we were still in the ecclesiology of Leo XIII, who defined the church as a perfect society. And the thought that the church itself could be guilty of sin is still an obstacle for our thinking about this. I referred earlier to the church's progress in relation to the Jewish people. The milestone we remember at the millennium preceding John Paul II's apology, but we remember could also have been called we forget too, because it was very clear an apology, a reckoning for the sin of anti-Semitism of which members of the church were guilty. As if the anti-Semites were these people who were actually bad Catholics. No, the good Catholics. The people in your three-point schema, the ideology, the practice, and the biblical interpretation, all anti-Semitic. The church itself was guilty of anti-Semitism. John Paul II could not bring himself to say that. For the same reason, I think that Jim put his finger on. Can the church actually reckon with its own sinfulness, its structural sinfulness? It's an ecclesiological problem. Of course, the Holocaust has helped us move away from it because the Holocaust showed us the church itself was guilty. And the abuse crisis is helping us because the abuse crisis, not so much the predator priests, but the universally complicit bishops. What is with those men? Even now, what is with those men? And what is with the vast population of Catholic priests who are bystanders to this problem? What is with those men? What about the vast population of Catholic people engaged with the church who are bystanders to this problem? What is with us? Why is this still an issue? It's true, of course, Laurel, that abuse of children and other vulnerable people is not a Catholic issue. It's a human issue. The family is a cockpit of violence against children. We know that. But the Catholic Church has its own particular form of this malevolence, and it's grotesque, mostly because God is invoked. The sacred is invoked in this abuse. The sacrament of penance is exploited and perverted again and again in this abuse, and the power structure of the church itself. As for Francis proved that I was right, referring it to myself, of course, not to let go of the Vatican II hope and the coming again of a John the 23rd. But Francis has blinked. It's true, of course, that he's being pushed against by reactionaries brutally. But actually, in the end, he's going to have left the church to them. He has synodality. Laurel, I love your embrace of the idea. The synod, Francis's, what could be more beautiful than the watchword? What affects all must be decided by all. Except it's not happening. The German church was serious about a synodality that included lay people in real ways, and the preparation for the German synod was being conducted with lay people in power, which the Vatican rejected only 6 weeks ago. Whatever process is underway in Germany cannot be considered synodality. This is not a synod. The synod underway, the preparation in this country is, again, lay people have marginal and token participation. The synod, Pope Francis, the year of the synod, Pope Francis, it's a sham. Pope Francis, the structure of clericalism. He denounces clericalism but does nothing to deal with the three pillars of clericalism. Obviously, mandatory celibacy, obviously the misogynist exclusion of women from orders, and obviously the priest as a member of a power elite caste. He could have done something powerful in response to the Amazon bishops who asked him explicitly, please, Your Holiness, ordain married deacons to give us the Eucharist. Please admit women to the diaconate. Not a revolutionary change, incremental change. The diaconate exists. It was brought back to the church after 1,000 years as a real formal order only in 1967. It's a work in progress. The diaconate is the opening through which the church can reform its structures of ministry. Pope Francis has kept the door closed. Francis is, well, I'm sorry, one last point. Can this structural institution be reformed? I've seen it being reformed my whole life long. I was born into a church of no salvation outside the church. That's gone. Nobody believes that. That's major. I'm an American. There's nothing I can accuse the Catholic Church of that I can't accuse something equivalent or worse, my own country. Can my country change? I used to want to have a Pope John the 23rd. Maybe all I really want is a Mikhail Gorbachev. Can the institution of the Soviet Union be transformed? Mikhail Gorbachev showed that it could be, nonviolently. Because of grassroots movements, Lech Walesa, Solidarity, alas, for many complicated reasons, Vladimir Putin shows that the transformation doesn't necessarily have to take. But transformation at this deep level is possible. If it wasn't, and if we didn't think so, we wouldn't be here tonight.
Let me turn to some questions from the audience. I have one on retainer that I'd like to ask if I can before we get to it, but let's turn to the audience. It seems to me that, this is from the language of the author, it seems to me the church only apologizes once they get caught for perpetuating abuse or any other unjust structure. How can the culture of the church be changed to be more progressive and proactive? This is open to anyone.
If you believe that the key issue is to absolve from guilt, that's going to make it difficult.
Your microphone's
If you believe that you have to be absolved from guilt, that's going to be a deal breaker. It's going to be very hard. If you believe in the possibility of forgiveness of sin, then I think it is at least theoretically possible, because to go back to the Pauline insight, sin abounds, but somehow grace the more abounds, or the scholastic insight about theological anthropology, that grace presumes our human nature and builds on it and completes it in that way. And I think that is a possibility. We need a paradigm shift, though, to recognize as social beings, we are, part of our identity is the institutions in which we were socialized. Let me give you one quick little example. When I lived in Korea, Korea, as I'm sure most of you know, is a divided country, and it's divided largely because of failures in US and Soviet foreign policy. And the Korean Jesuits, this was a great resentment that they had, and they would come to me because I was the youngest, I suppose, American Jesuit living there. And I said, I wasn't even born. I'm old, but not that old. I wasn't even born when the Korean War broke out. I had no power, no position to play. But then I came to realize that is all true, but I am an American, and I live in and out of that privilege that this has created, and therefore I have a responsibility in some way to try to resolve this sin. And I think that if the church institutionally could say something like that, I think then the social grace could take deeper root and move forward. But if you want to say, never explain, what is it, the mantra, never explain, never say you're sorry, never explain, that is a sinful mantra.
I'm wondering whose mantra that is. That is a terrible mantra.
I didn't author it.
Yeah, good. I've been thinking over your description, which when you first articulated it, I wasn't too sure. Where sin abounds, grace abounds, something like that. But your description just now parallels with my own thinking through the church's complicity in the long history of racism, of white supremacy, that if the church could face that and address that and transform that, then grace would abound, right? The break is so egregious that it could only be the transformative work of grace that this repair was happening. right? So why wouldn't we, so back to the question, how do we, I think this was the question, how do we foster a culture of a church that can change? Right? So facing the egregious breaks, I think that so many of the white Catholics that I work with say the same thing that you said in the Korean context, which is, look, I had nothing to do with slavery, right? I'm a nice person. You can't hold me responsible, right? But what if we take responsibility for those failures of our institution? What if we really face those failures head on? Ask those questions of analysis. How did lay people who were bystanders in the sexual abuse crisis, right? How are we part of an institution that we do bear some of the complicity of that institution? So I think that facing the evil is a part of what will foster that culture of change. But I also think we need to be, I've been thinking about this a long time since Zach first asked some of these questions for us to be thinking about, that I think we need to have the same critical engagement with our institution. We have to have that same critical engagement with our tradition all the way back to our sacred texts. So if you go to the section that Laurel read for us, I'm so sorry that I keep, oh, maybe we won't get there. Oh, I ruined it. If you go, but you can Google it. The section where 70 times 7 is found, which is Matthew chapter 18. My point that I'm getting to here is that we have to be critically engaged with all components of our tradition so that we recognize our complicity in the clericalism, the complicity in the violence. It goes all the way back to the origins of our tradition. You're right at the punchline of this, but that's, sorry about that, right? So the beginning of Matthew 18 is about turning to the least of these. You can Google this. It's about turning to the least of these. There's a beautiful section that offers a protocol for forgiveness, right? Confront the one who has wronged you. Bring witnesses. If that doesn't work, bring it before the church as a whole. Right? Is that possible in this model of, it wasn't a discipleship of equals, but it was something like that, this model of how do we look at this failure together, right? And then 70 times 7 times comes in, right? But right after that, it's horrifying because the kingdom of God can be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. And the story, the parable goes on, and at the punchline of the parable is that the king says, why didn't you forgive your other slave? I'm throwing you to be tortured. And Jesus says, so our heavenly Father will deal with you. Well, that God who is power hungry and violent is not foreign to our sacred text. And I think we have to stand and say that part of our tradition is not a part of the tradition that we're willing to walk forward with. And I don't think that we do that. I think we just say, oh, that's not what they meant, right? Oh, we don't even hear that God is a slaveholder thirsty for torture. We don't hear that, right? I think we have to really be critical all the way down. And that's not easy.
Let me pose another question. I'll sneak mine in as well. Jim Bretzke, you mentioned Francis-free zones in seminaries. And I'm wondering if you could speak to, or anyone on the panel can speak to, what it is that accounts for the resistance to Pope Francis. And I'm wondering, just as this conversation has gone on, whether it's some formation of the imagination that there is a right and there is a wrong, and that the church holds the right and everything else is the wrong, or the sin is the wrong, and there's ways of being in and out. And whether that is so ingrained that we can't permit mercy because mercy acknowledges some love toward those who have done wrong, and it sort of messes up the formula. That's part of the question. The second question is, and this goes back to the larger reformation or the reform of the church, being whether there is hope for a reform of the priesthood, and I guess built into that question is whether that will aid in this process of acknowledging the faults of the institution. So while I raise Jim Bretzke's example from earlier, the question is open to the floor. Is there hope for a reform to the priesthood?
Yes, because we believe as an article of faith that the Holy Spirit will never definitively depart from the church. The indefectibility aspect of the church. So yes, I believe that is true. The sin of clericalism is built in, the foundation of the sin of clericalism is the sin of sexism, in my view, which is this view that somehow males do have or ought to have a greater power, authority, and everything else. I live now in, I lived here for 10 years. I lived in Berkeley. I lived in San Francisco Bay for 15. So these are a teensy bit more liberal than Cleveland in Ohio. But Trump carried Ohio twice. And I think legitimately, that is to say, I don't think it was voter fraud. And many of my students, some of whom are collegiate seminarians, they have been socialized in this sexist view of who men are, who men ought to be, and as priests, that this is what they're going to do. They're going to restore the church back to the way it never was. They're not very good at history either. But they're going to restore to the church back to what they thought John Paul II was lifting up, or Pius XII was lifting up. And that's sinful. That is a sin. That's more than a failure. That's a sin of moral imagination. And so how do you in canon law, there is this expression, Jim will know it, sanatio in redice. You remember that from your canon law?
That part of my Latin is gone, Father.
In canon law, if you do something really bad in the celebration of a sacrament, usually the sacrament of marriage, if you make some sort of big mistake in your preparation for getting the marriage out there, you have an invalid marriage. And when it's discovered, you have to do this legal hocus pocus that somehow corrects the error without, destroying the marriage and moving forward. And that's what in Latin they call a sanatio, which is a healing. Sanation is the English word, in radice, to the very roots. Well, we need, I think here, we need a sanatio in radice, or radice, depending on how you want to pronounce that word. So how are we going to get that sanatio? That, I think, is the challenge, but we can't be doing it alone. We have to be doing it with God's grace.
I think I'd like to come back also to this idea of not looking to the center of unhealthily held power, but looking to the margins for some answers and some models. It's totally true that synodality is not taking off either in Germany or in the United States. In 1910, something like 2/3 of the Catholic Church was in Italy and France. And in 2010, 2/3 of the Catholic Church was in what we call the global south, or the majority world, or whatever term you want to use for it. And so I think where the church is really alive and growing and talking about these questions in, I think, an interesting and hopeful way, is not in Germany or in the United States. I want to talk a little bit about the synod in the Amazon. When it was finished, the document that the bishops voted on, an overwhelming majority wanting to pursue the issue of women in the diaconate, wanting to be able to ordain married men as priests, wanting to have a specific ministry for women in church leadership, that final document was left by Francis as an authoritative document that stands on its own. His apostolic exhortation, Querida Amazonia, is not to overshadow it and does not block it out either. Francis, in his own letter, upholds the document finalized by the bishops in the synod, which differs from his own conclusions as authoritative and as a plan of action for the church in the Amazon. Also, those of you who are familiar with Latin American theology history will have heard of the bishops' conferences in Medellin, in Puebla, the Latin American Bishops' Conference meetings that really promoted liberation theology for a while. There's a new movement going on now, formation happening for what would be a 6th Latin American bishops meeting, but they're having a church network meeting instead. So instead of the Latin American bishops meeting for a 6th time, they've decided to invite religious brothers and sisters, secular lay people, and non-Catholics to participate with a voice and a vote in a conference, in a process together. The preparation for that began over the summer, and I'm only marginally involved in some of these communities, and I've been invited to Zoom calls and conferences and workshops to kind of think through what are the issues that want to be presented at this conference. So I think if I'm a pretty marginal person here, there's a really good faith effort happening right now to kind of see what people are thinking and cull the opinions of a variety of levels of interaction with the church to set an agenda for what's going on in the Latin American church in the regional bishops conference. So I really do think that maybe in previous decades we've had this model that there's going to be a victoria final, there's going to be a final answer that's going to really fix everything. We just need to find the third middle way between the two extreme options. And what I think we're seeing more now are tiny pockets of resistance and survival. And as long as people are resisting and surviving, something that spark is alive. In speaking to one of my own mentors and just thinking about the incredible, egregious sins that continue to plague us all the time, I remember asking him, how do you get up and keep doing this work every day? And he just says, so that Jesus doesn't die. That's why he gets up and does his work every day. So if someone is surviving, if somebody is resisting on the model of Jesus, the victim of our sin, I think that's where we need to be looking. It's not going to be a powerful play with a grand scheme. It's going to be a small pocket of resistance, localized, contextual, unheard of, and that's where I think we have to look for a model.
Jim, we have a question for you. I don't want to cut you off on. Let me add a question, then you can respond to them, and then take the second question on,
Okay.
if you don't mind. Having followed the Archdiocese of Boston since the sex abuse scandal, offering your op-eds and things, what would have happened if the Archdiocese of Boston would have been given a progressive, forward-thinking bishop? What hope would have existed then? What would have been different in the fallout?
At what point, Zach?
I think following the sex abuse, following Spotlight, Cardinal Law, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, let me put that aside for
Please,
a minute.
yep.
I want to say how grateful I am for what Laurel just said. There was a bit of a correction of me in that, which I take because my focus on Germany and the United States is parochial, and your more global perspective is crucial, and I'm really glad for it. You began this go-round by asking whether the Catholic priesthood, I've forgotten the verb you used, but could be saved, could be
Reformed.
Yep. I made some enemies when I published an article that was headlined, "The Priesthood Should Be Abolished." And I mean that. But of course, by priesthood, I'm referring to this particular cultural artifact, phenomenon, that is what we mean by the priesthood in the Catholic tradition right now. And I invited and wanted to invite again that we think historically about the priesthood, because the priesthood that we think of as a given structure of our church is not given. It's created. And the priesthood we know owes more to the Council of Trent and the kings of the Middle Ages and the offices of the Roman Empire than it does to anything Jesus imagined. And we, the church, are obliged constantly to measure our life against the memory of and the text we have about Jesus Christ, which we've been doing here tonight. The priesthood is actually in the process right now of being reformed. Part of what Laurel just said implies it. But also Laurel's reference to the many, many people who turned away from the Catholic Church, crossed over the margin and out. They're reforming the Catholic priesthood. You know this, I know, that the Pew Research Center that tells us who we are as religious people said that last year or 2 years ago, the second largest religious denomination in the United States, defined loosely, are former Catholics. And people who associate still as Catholics, but who do not associate with the formal institution, are experiencing the Eucharist in countless ways. The tradition being observed, the reflection on the word, the proclamation of the word, the breaking of the bread. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am among them. Those are the little acts of resistance that are also part of what I think Laurel is talking about. The priesthood is in the process of being reformed. 100 years from now, there will be a Eucharist at the center of Catholic life. Will it look like what we think of as the Eucharist? It may or may not. We saw a photograph in the New York Times this morning of the reactionary, or was it the Washington Post, the reactionary Catholics who are rejecting Francis, but a priest in the Tridentine fiddleback vestment with somebody holding it up. That return to the Latin Mass as a form of Catholic resistance. Well, there may be Catholics observing the Eucharist like that 100 years from now. I hope so, because it will suggest the church has experienced a kind of pluralism. That's all right. But that won't be the main way the Eucharist is remembered or observed. So I think that the demographics of the Catholic priesthood are also a function of reform. The fact that we're all so old. Jim is one of the younger priests. Well, Jim, I say that respectfully, but if you weren't alive during the Korean War, I promise you, you're one of the younger priests. But you put another question on the table for me, but I don't remember what it was.
One of the audience members asked whether if a different bishop had been assigned to Boston following the sex abuse crisis. And
well, I think we should all be grateful for the goodness of Cardinal O'Malley, his authentic virtue, and that's the most important thing. Cardinal O'Malley is not, a liberal by traditional standards, but that's not the most important thing. My own question isn't so much about the bishops, it's about the rest of us. Cardinal Law would not have been forced to resign by the Vatican. He was weathering the storm of the Globe reports really quite well. It was only when 52 or 53 senior priests of the Archdiocese published an open letter. They addressed it to him and they made it public. And it began, Your Eminence, we have lost confidence in your leadership as the Archbishop of Boston, and we call upon you to resign. And 3 days later, Law was gone. Now, his fate as a bishop was what it would have been is indicated by the fact that he was put into a prestigious sinecure in Rome where he stayed until he died. The priests of the Archdiocese of Boston made the crucial intervention for reform. I lament that turns out to have been a one-off. Where are the priests demanding that the bishops respond to this crisis? And where are the lay people? How many employees of the Catholic Church are there around the globe? Millions. Doctors, teachers, organizers, catechists. They're part of the life of the Catholic Church. Where are they in this crisis? Look, Martin Luther was incensed over indulgences. Is the rape of children less grave than indulgences? The systematic protection of the rapists? The changes that we're talking about can only come from the grassroots up. I hear Laurel making reference to a kind of grassroots perspective in the global church. But it's very clear by now that the change is not coming from the congregation of the doctrine of the faith. The grassroots, what brought down the Iron Curtain, the grassroots. And the Catholic Church at the level of the grassroots is a desert.
Jeannine, Jim, Laurel, and Jim, I want to thank you for your time. Unfortunately, we don't have more of it, but if I could ask all of you to join me in thanking our panelists for this conversation this evening.